Welcome to The Blue Dot, Northern Kentucky's premier political podcast, brought to you by the Kent County Democratic Executive Committee. Thanks for joining The Blue Dot podcast. I'm Natalie MacDonald. In every episode, we break down the issues that affect our communities, including local leadership, big infrastructure ideas, and what the future holds for the region. And today we have State Representative Matt Lehman, who represents the 67th District in Campbell County, to discuss a little bit of all of these issues.
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Brian Koehl. Representative Lehman comes into public service with a unique background as a healthcare entrepreneur and medical research professional who co-founded a company focused on innovative opioid-free treatments for pancreatitis patients. Now, in his first term in the Kentucky House, he's bringing that same problem-solving mindset to Frankfort.
And he's also focusing on issues that directly impact Northern Kentucky, from economic development and workforce growth to infrastructure and accountability in major projects. Representative Lehman, thanks so much for joining us today.
Glad to be here. I'm Natalie, Brian, looking forward to it.
Yeah. Well, Representative Lehman, or may I call you Matt?
You can call me Matt, please. Yeah.
Matt, you've been an extremely active member of the legislature, so we have a lot to talk about with you, but I want to hand it over to you first. You can tell our listeners a little bit about who you are, a little bit of your background, and your why you decided to jump in the Kentucky State House and try to help solve some of the issues that everyday Kentuckians face.
Yeah. Well, look, I'm native Northern Kentuckian. I actually grew up in Kenton County way on the other side of the Licking River, but father and husband have a lot of family and friends throughout the region. And, I care very, very deeply about Northern Kentucky and its growth and its success. And, what can we do to make this a place of opportunity, a place that people want to stay, people want to move back to, and people want to move to and invest in. So it's, trying to do my part to help make that happen.
Yeah, and you've certainly been busy. Just looking over all of the different pieces of legislation you've been involved in, everything you've been doing for your district. So we'll start at the state level. And for those who may not really follow Frankfort very closely, can you tell us some of the key priorities you've been focused on in the Kentucky legislature lately and in the last session?
Yeah, sure. So just to step back. So we finished our 2026 regular session in mid-April. So we had a 60-day session. The biggest part of these even years are we do a 2-year budget in Kentucky. So we did get that done. So, the budget priorities, but it's, you do what you can. But yeah, I mean, when you come in a role like this, I mean, you do quickly learn. I mean, there's a million things going on, from education to healthcare to roads and infrastructure and economic development and tax policy. I mean, you can't be an expert on everything, so I do try to, you try to make friends and people you trust, colleagues, both Democrats and Republicans, that, help when, we're voting on matters that maybe I'm not as up to speed on. That's a really important skill set, I would say, in this job, is to be able to learn from other people, listen, and trust, and whose judgment you can trust. I do spend a lot, and part of it's also my committee assignments are in workforce, economic development and workforce investment, small business, and information technology. I mean, these are areas that I like and enjoy. I think they're very important to the growth of Northern Kentucky. So I do think you see some of my legislation does center around that. And again, that's a lot of my committee work as well. So it's, like I said, what motivated me to get into this is I think Northern Kentucky has a real opportunity. We've had a good run the last few years. I do think the growth is going to continue. And I think there's a whole lot of macro, beyond just what we're doing at the state level and the county level and the local level. There's just a lot of macro trends. When you look at places like Northern Kentucky, it is going to grow and is going to continue to grow, and maybe faster than any of us expect. So from the Ohio River to proximity to Cincinnati, the 71-75 corridor, 2 major logistics hubs now at CVG Airport. I think these things we're going to start looking more like places like Northern Virginia than we are Kentucky. And so I talk about not just me, there's a lot of people that talk about this, and growth can be uncomfortable sometimes, but there's a lot we can do to plan for it, to mitigate and make sure that growth is working for us, making sure that it turns into opportunities for people living here and doesn't become a burden. So that's all. that, I do a lot, but those are sort of the guiding principles behind what I'm looking at every day.
It's got to be hard to juggle that, especially in Northern Kentucky, and then with the collaboration all across the 3 counties as well. So when you talk about, there's so many things in the legislature, you talk about education, healthcare. It's how do you prioritize that? I mean, as you for yourself, I guess, and then as a whole, I just, you see so many bills, 1,000 bills. It's like, how do we, like the average Joes, kind of keep this stuff straight?
That's an interesting question. And there's 100 of us in the House of Representatives, and sometimes it's hard to figure out, as much as you say, oh, maybe the Speaker of the House or the House leadership knows. Sometimes there's a lot of, it's kind of like swimming, and there's lots of cross currents, and it's not always easy to figure out and predict. If you would have asked me in December what was the biggest priority we were going to be tackling, it was going to be housing and housing costs and the housing shortages. And there was a ton of effort made. There were a number of bills. The Democrats had a platform. Republicans had a bunch of bills. We had some bipartisan work, and very little got done in that regard.
Yeah.
So it's interesting sometimes, just the process. And like I said, it's not as, cut and dry sometimes you may hope or expect. There's a bit of, it's hard to predict that sometimes.
Yeah. It's probably behind the scenes. It's like watching sausage get made, right? Like,
yeah, that's generous.
Well, and I never, when I, first started doing the podcast, I'll be honest, I didn't know that much about politics in the Commonwealth. And one of the shocking things was just how short the legislative sessions are. So not only is there a lot to do, but it's 30 days every other year, it's 60 days, right? So, I mean,
Correct.
That is not a whole lot of time to get a whole lot done.
Well, I'll put it yes and no. So, I mean, we do work. I mean, I'm in Frankfort today. We have, we take May off. That's the only, I guess we get to go to the Derby and go to graduation parties, but
right.
We are in what we call the interim session now. So we're not allowed to pass laws, but we do a whole lot. I mean, I was at a 2-hour transportation committee meeting today. We reviewed the laws we did pass. We reviewed the laws that were passed in previous sessions and where they are in the update. We start talking about things that will be potentially legislation when we come back in January. So there is a lot of work that gets done year round. It's just, our Constitution. And okay, I mean, if you look at states are all over the place, but our Constitution is written in a way that, we are limited to making laws during those very specific sessions. So it does feel like we're trying to get a lot done, but the bills we're generally passing are usually things we've been talking about all year. So it's not quite like it just comes out of nowhere.
Okay, that's
all
good.
The time. There's always a surprise or two, but
right. Yeah. Well, and then going back to Northern Kentucky and its growth, I think one of the biggest conversations right now is the future of the Northern Kentucky Port Authority. And you've taken a leading role in pushing for transparency and reform as our region looks how major investments are made. You introduced legislation, House Bill 761, to modernize Kentucky's River Port Authority laws. For our listeners who are unfamiliar with the Port Authority and this initiative, can you talk a little bit about what it is and why it matters?
Sure. And there's a lot to be said. So,
in the weeds again, here we go.
Even, I do want to mention, so we had some interesting primary elections in Northern Kentucky, mostly on the Republican side. I do think there has been a growing feeling in Northern Kentucky. So we are unique. The 2 other large metro areas of this state, Louisville and Lexington, are consolidated county city governments. Look, there's pluses and minuses, all forms of government. The simple truth that we have dozens and dozens of municipalities, 3 major counties, and then you can even think of Grant and Pendleton County and Bracken County kind of surrounding us as part of Northern Kentucky as well. So we have lots of various municipalities and counties over history, and for many, many good reasons. We have far more of these municipal and inter-county kind of, I would say, sometimes super governments, or, everything from the Northern Kentucky Health Department to, Health Department, Sanitation District, or Water District, things like the Port Authority as well, that this is not how most other areas or kind of metropolitan regions in Kentucky work. Like I said, there's a lot of good historic reasons. I think a lot of these organizations do a lot of good. I do think there's some and again, especially with this pressure of growth and increased traffic and housing prices going up, I think there's a little bit of a frustration about who in Northern Kentucky do you complain to when you don't like when traffic on I-75 is too heavy. When you're in Lexington, Fayette County, there is a single city council. You know where to go during public comment. In Northern Kentucky, you don't have that. And so I do think there's a bit of this bubbling concern, or maybe even a little bit of populism that is resentful of how a lot of decisions are getting made in Northern Kentucky. And I do talk a lot to, the powers that be, if you will, and from the Chamber of Commerce to other organizations, that I think as a lot of different groups in Northern Kentucky need to start doing a little better job of making sure these types of governments are a little more transparent, more accountable, and a little more focused on what people actually want and not sort of being driven by outside agendas. So anyway, that's a bit of a preface to this. My interest in the Northern Kentucky Port Authority, look, it was 2 years ago, April of 2024, kind of a last second addition to the budget that year. And I was not in office, but I did see that come out. There was an announcement there was going to be a state allocation of $125 million for what was being termed the Commonwealth Biomedical Center of Excellence. And that's still the name of this project. There weren't a lot of details initially. It kind of quickly said, well, the idea behind this was to move the Chase Law School and the UK medical program, the medical school program that's currently in Highland Heights on NKU's main campus, to move it to Covington, downtown Covington, which even at that time, I found to be peculiar. Look, I think you mentioned, I work in biotech and medical research. I've worked at various biotech incubators and biomedical centers around the world, from Germany to Japan to Louisville, Kentucky, California, New York, Maryland. I've seen, and I think what, let's say, frustrated me about this idea or policy was it does not, and still does not, as a program, it doesn't leverage any private sector investment, philanthropic funding. It doesn't leverage federal grants. Most of these other places are kind of run by universities. I'd like to have seen that $125 million leveraged into several $100 million more of private sector, philanthropic, and even other, federal government funding to really develop a growth opportunity for the region. And unfortunately, like I said, my big criticism of that project has been it's really not much more than moving existing programs 6 miles away. Okay. So that's one. And look, there should be a lot of opportunity for public debate and public discussion when you talk about doing projects like that. So, that's the project itself. Behind it is, and kind of comes back to what, at this point, I just call it the ghost governments of Northern Kentucky. This was a term originally coined by Adam Evelyn some 14 years ago. He was the Kentucky auditor, and he did a big report on these sort of super regional government types of, or not special purpose government entities. And so this leads you to the Port Authority and the way this Commonwealth Biomedical Center of Excellence project has been led and executed. And I think there's a lot of flaws. So one, Kentucky River Port authorities, the statute in Kentucky currently limits these authorities to river navigation and related projects. There are 9 other river port authorities in the state of Kentucky. So Owensboro, McCracken County, and Paducah, Louisville, I'm trying to out near Ashland and Greenup County. They run what you would understand as a river port, with rail lines and terminals and how you get things on and off the river and transportation related activities. There's a whole history. You can look it up online. Why we have a Northern Kentucky Port Authority. It started in the late 60s. They looked at various opportunities, especially on the Licking River, to develop a river port. It never came together for, any number of reasons. It was basically dormant for decades. And it sort of got picked up about 2 years ago, maybe a little longer than that, by what's called BNKY, which used to be called Triad. And this is it's a nonprofit economic development organization to support Northern Kentucky. They've done a lot of great work over the years, BNKY has. This is not an elected organization. It's an appointed board of, various people that mean well. But again, there's no direct tie to the voters or people who are elected at BNKY. And they kind of determined that they now manage the Northern Kentucky Port Authority. And the Port Authority has substantial powers, from bonding capacity to eminent domain to not needing to follow local zoning and planning. I mean, again, the types
Wow.
of powers you would give a government organization.
Yeah.
And anyway, that's a long way of saying is, like, I think when you start trying to make policy through these ghost governments, I think the result you get is not great projects. Not that there's ill intentions necessarily behind it, but the process was flawed. And I still think it's flawed. So anyway, House Bill 761, I did introduce legislation that would effectively legalize or authorize what the Northern Kentucky Port Authority is doing, which are general economic development projects around Northern Kentucky. I modeled that legislation after Ohio legislation, so people in Northern Kentucky, we may look at the Cincinnati Port Authority. Well, they have very different statutory authority in Ohio. And also in Ohio, even though port authorities are allowed to do all sorts of things that aren't riverport related, they also have pretty significant oversight requirements, transparency requirements. There's a lot of requirements about how the board gets appointed. So there's municipal representation, there's county representation. So that process matters. When you're doing big projects with lots of taxpayer money, you really need to have the trust of the public, and pick up the trust of the public along the way. And that is done through far more transparent. So that was what my attempt was with House Bill 761, was to kind of increase the statutory authority of our port authorities as real growth opportunities, but also make sure there was the accountability and oversight and transparency that such organizations would require to be successful.
So you were saying that they do have that kind of infrastructure and accountability in the Ohio port. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, so exactly. The boards are appointed by elected officials. There's a really distinct tie to people who are elected by the voters and how they get represented on the board.
And how about the other? I think you said there were 9 ports in Kentucky. Are they similar to NKY Port, or is it more similar to the other?
So what's interesting, so all of the other ports in Kentucky run river ports. They are completely focused on river-related activities, transportation. And so the way their boards, and so in statute, we do have procedures for how the boards are appointed for river port authorities. And depending on whether you're multi-county or a county-city port authority, there is representation from the counties and the cities or the counties. To make a point, so the Northern Kentucky Port Authority, the way that charter was written, that there are 2 appointees each from Boone, Kenton, and Campbell County. So there is a 6-member board that are appointed by the judge executives of those 3 counties. But like I said, in practice, the issue has been the Port Authority has become a tool being used by BNKY, which is setting the policy. BNKY does not have elected representation. So that's where the difference is.
That makes a lot of sense. That really clarifies a lot of questions that I
was just
going to
say, you may feel like that was a long-winded explanation with a lot of background info, but that was exactly what I was looking for, because as I was researching a little bit prior to the podcast, I was really kind of struggling to understand what the Port Authority originally was intended for, what it is in general, because a Port Authority to me was exactly what you said. You govern ports and manage ports, and this seemed to be beyond that. So that was a really good explanation, I think, of tying that all together, and especially how the governance in Northern Kentucky is so much different than like in Louisville and Lexington. Again, it makes perfect sense, but you don't always think about it in those terms. Yeah. So the complexity is much greater, and without that oversight, $125 million of taxpayer money just going to something without any kind of putting it before the people, even, that doesn't make sense. So it sounds like a pretty common sense bill. Appreciate you
I would think
that.
so. And it's interesting. I mean, well, look, any legislation is hard. I mean, you talk to people who've been here 20, 30 years. Sometimes it takes multiple cycles and just to build consensus. I did find it interesting. So the kind of the biggest objection I had to that bill came from some of the other port authorities, the river port authorities of Kentucky. And their position was like, we're doing fine. So a lot of them, especially Paducah, I mean, I don't remember the number, but they just got a very substantial federal grant to kind of modernize some of their port operations. They're planning to restart some of there was the gaseous diffusion plant. So they do nuclear material, I forget, uranium enrichment in Paducah, and they did, and now they're planning to restart that. So they had to upgrade a lot of their port. And so they didn't want to have anything to do with expanding outside of running river ports. They thought it kind of diluted the focus a bit. So we'll see where those conversations go.
Yeah, and you said the judge executive is the one who appoints the board. And so I was wondering if even like the commissioners had a role in that. So I see now like where that board gets appointed. So that's really like the only kind of tie that we have to any kind of accountability then.
Yes. And I don't know. I mean, in practice, I don't know if the judge's executive take some advice from the commissioners or not, but in statute, they are directly appointed by the judge's executive themselves.
So where do you see it all going in 5 years or so? Do you see just this massive growth? Do you think there's going to be some accountability and reining in and some?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't have a crystal ball. Like I said, I would, and again, I talked to a lot of people about that. I do think we've seen in some of these recent elections, and again, some people call it more populist. I mean, obviously, some of those representatives and people have run against long-term incumbents in recent cycles that have won in Republican primaries. There's the Liberty Caucus, or they're a little more populist, or the Freedom Caucus. I do think that it's tapping into that feeling of there's lots of stuff that happens in Northern Kentucky, lots of decisions are getting made, but it's hard to know, like I said, who to talk to or who to complain to, and Cincinnati, you got a big city, you have a mayor. I mean, Cincinnati is entirely within one county with a 3-person commission. Like you kind of know where to go and other areas. It's not always clear in Northern Kentucky who's responsible for certain things. So I hope that I'm hopeful we can find some ways to have more public accountability and transparency on these types of projects.
Well, taking a look at yeah. Go ahead, Matt.
No, I was just going to say, you did mention the primaries. And so I wanted to see if we could pick your brain about that just a little bit. That congressional fourth, you ran for that seat. And we have Melissa Strange, who is, I think, a fantastic candidate. Yeah. So I just thought we'd get your 2 cents since we had you.
2 cents. I've always said I don't have crystal ball. I predicted in January Thomas Massie was going to lose. People looked at me like I was crazy. Most of those people were Democrats. I mean, you can agree or disagree. I mean, I think there's things you can, certain issues I think I can appreciate what Thomas Massie stood on principle for, especially recently. Mm-hmm. I do think it's nice to see when you have the legislative and the executive branch are different branches by design, even when you're in the same party. So I do think having independent voices is important, but I mean, the truth is he was been in office 14 years and, really did not do a lot for his constituents. And at some point, I think I heard somebody on either another podcast or on the radio said, look, there's been sort of the not fond of Thomas Massie Republicans in the 4th District for a long time. A lot of those people were in elected office. So if you talk to mayors and judges, executives, and it was very frustrating because, he was not a congressman that was like, hey, I'm going to help you out on federal issues and try to get money back to your district. That was just not how he worked. So that was there. Then you just had, the super Trump and a wing and a lot of money.
Yeah.
Those 2 things came together and that's what happened, is my guess. But interestingly, and I do think it was interesting, like I said, elections are so the head of kind of the Liberty wing of Northern Kentucky lost his primary. All of the Liberty candidates that are in office survived their primaries. And in fact, there was one more kind of Liberty candidate that beat an incumbent and Kim Banta, who represents the 63rd district in Kenton and Boone counties. So she lost a very, very narrow race. So, the Liberty caucus kind of picked up 1 seat in the state legislature. So,
Well, we wanted to pivot to a couple of the other things that you look at in the this year's legislature. I mean, one of the things that sets you and other Democrats, apart from the Republicans that we feel and we talk about a lot on the podcast, set you apart from the supermajority is that we feel Democrats are focused on those kitchen table topics that really do mean the most to Kentuckians, and especially those in your district. So, and you've sponsored and supported a ton of legislation, 39 bills in 2026 and 23 bills in 2025. You're a busy guy. And you also have a background in healthcare innovation. So can you talk about some of the bills that you supported that are related to healthcare and family policy, food security, some of these really important issues?
Sure. And I think the one I'm I actually did. It's also interesting as you go through these. You sponsor some bills, some of them get folded into other bills, and like it's always an interesting process. It's not quite like the old cartoon said about how a bill becomes law. There's a whole lot
Okay.
more than that.
I'm just a
Yeah,
bill.
so what I'm proud of was allowing schools to stock and administer glucagon, and for kids that are having diabetic emergency, it's technically a prescription product, but the safety profile makes sense that someone who's qualified to administer glucagon should be able to do that. And again, shows you how long some of this stuff takes. It was actually I picked that up from it was actually Sherilyn Stevenson, who was in the State House for a while before I came. I picked up, she had initially sponsored that, I think 3 or 4 years ago. I continued to work on it. Finally, it actually got picked up, and that was part of an omnibus, a healthcare bill that was ultimately sponsored by Kim Mosier. So we got that as part of the bill and passed finally this year. So
It's great.
it's I mean, and there's some other things you try, but the truth is, unless we had more numbers, it's hard to get some of the bigger ideas. But the smaller ones, I guess something I'm very proud of. I mean, there was a big Medicaid reform bill that was called House Bill 2 this year. It was rough. I mean, we're going to see a lot of cuts to Medicaid. It is going to impact all of the hospitals and providers, which is then going to affect patient care in this state. I acknowledge our state was put in a very difficult position by the big beautiful bill at the federal level last year. We're losing literally billions and billions of dollars a year in federal funding to help our Medicaid program. I like I said, I do want to acknowledge the sponsor of that bill is Ken Fleming from Louisville. He did a lot of work. I voted no on it. I disagree. I think the governor and the Democratic caucus proposed some alternatives that would have been a little bit gentler and kinder on the population. But, we did a lot of work, like even small things. So, the initial draft of that bill would have had $20 copays for patients on Medicaid. Or I should say certain patients on Medicaid. And, you actually just get into the real life and you talk to physicians who take Medicaid patients. They're never going to get a $20 copay. I mean, it just is not happening. And so it becomes either the doctors just waive it and just don't ever try to collect it, or patients see that and they get scared and it becomes a barrier to getting effective care. We tried to get that removed. We got it down to $1. So it's $1 copay now instead of a $20 copay. So this is a lot of the stuff we end up working on to try to make some of this a little bit better. And like I said, I will give credit to, even some of the Republican sponsors of those types of priority bills. They do listen and they will take some of our feedback into account. We don't always get what we want, but like I said, that was one example. It is just, it is hard. It's hard, from my value system and what I think a lot of the Democratic caucus, our value system is very focused on making sure people can afford to live and have opportunities. And if you don't have a solid healthcare system and you're not healthy and you don't have access to quality care, I mean, it's hard. I mean, just about anything else doesn't work.
Impacts everything. That's
yeah,
right.
And I also talk about, it's funny. Like I said, I have started my own businesses. I'm an entrepreneur. I've been self-employed for a long time. And sometimes I talk about this from a very pro-business perspective. I mean, one of the biggest barriers to people who want to start a company or go out and try something on their own is health insurance.
100%.
And how important it is. I mean, I don't think people, sometimes my colleagues across the aisle who are the so-called pro-business party don't understand how cumbersome this is for small businesses. And if you're a young person, you want to go, like I said, you have a great idea, you want to start a company or you want to be self-employed, a lot of people are resistant or scared to do that, to lose health insurance. And I think having a better, again, baseline Medicaid system would actually encourage some of those more entrepreneurial activities as well. So.
Great point.
And it's good to hear you talk about how you are able to work with some of the colleagues across the aisle. In one way, I'm a firm believer in my heart that I want to think that everybody plays nice in the sandbox more than we think they do. But then when you see
that's so sweet.
I know, but then when you see at the end of the session, what kind of comes out and what the supermajority has squashed, that you're like, well, I guess they don't play that nice in the sandbox. I don't know. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
I mean, it's, there's 100 of us and some are nice, some aren't, some are smart, some aren't. It's an interesting, It's not like any other job, I can tell you that. And
Yeah.
yeah, look, and I will say, I mean, you talk about that stuff. It was very frustrating. I mean, we did have a very comprehensive housing bill,
Yeah.
had a lot of bipartisan components. We were there the last night until very, very late trying to get it through. Republican leadership was absolutely determined. There was a provision in there to preempt local governments from regulating short-term rentals in Kentucky. So, in
Oh,
other words, the Frankfort would have prevented Covington or Erlanger or Boone County or whatever from having local regulations around Airbnbs and other short-term rentals. And it was basically a poison pill for that bill. And it took down the whole bill. I mean, the
wow.
reason we didn't get that housing bill passed is because they kept trying to shove that in. And I mean, even on the Republican side, there just was not enough support, and they kept putting it back in there, and ultimately we all suffer. So I
Wow.
guess it's not always a clean and easy process. But
What we got.
yeah.
That's true. That's true. Well, we don't want to keep you too long, man. I know you're a busy guy
Oh,
and got a lot going on. We did want to just ask about a couple of the committees. I don't know if I was watching another podcast you're on or read something where you're talking about the transportation committee, and you really, that was one that you're really interested in. And then you
oh
mentioned
yeah.
at the top, some of the other committees that you're in, some areas that you have a lot of interest in. How do those assignments happen? What are the committees you're in? I mean, what are the ones that really excite you, or you feel like, you have a great membership and can really make an impact?
Yeah. I think maybe in the general public, I don't think that the committee process is not always fully that is where a lot of the work happens.
Right.
I can tell you if the chair of a committee isn't gonna, be behind your bill, it is going nowhere. You got to get out of committee before you even get to the floor for debate.
Right.
And, most of these chairmen they're good and they're respected. And then a lot of them are there because they've earned the respect of their colleagues. So you tend not to see a lot of grandstanders and chairs of committees. And they will want to work with the members before, amending and bringing bills. And again, the time is now. We just started today. That's what's. I'm in Frankfort. We had transportation, the interim joint committee on transportation today. It was about 2 hours. We went through all sorts of things. I love that. That's everything from our highways and railroads and airports and river ports and anything you can get to move around. It's very important for our economy. It's important for our safety, just quality of life. And the other ones, like I said, I'm transportation, I'm on economic development and workforce investment. So that's where we thought was very good legislation. It was sponsored by a Republican that I respect. And that would have put a framework around data centers that
Wow.
if data centers were going to enter the state, they would have had to come to an agreement with the local energy company, with the power producer, that those data centers would actually have had to fully pay for the expected cost up front. And it again had a lot of bipartisan support, just couldn't quite get across the line. So I do hope thoughtful data center regulations can come back next year and we can finally get that resolved. The other committee I like a lot of my committee. It's always interesting. The other one was the small business and information technology.
Right.
And that was another bill that I really thought was going to get done and couldn't quite. We got it through the House, couldn't get it through the Senate. I suspect Meta and Google and those people gave a talking to over in the Senate. I was basically, we would have put some serious restrictions around the types of algorithms used for social media for people under 18, for
Wow.
kids in Kentucky, and doing so in a way that was very interesting. Doing so in a way we're not limiting free speech or freedom of expression, but just, concentrating on the product design and how these social media companies have really exploited especially
Oh,
kids.
yes.
They exploit
Yeah.
adults too, but I guess you say adults should know better. I'm not sure if we do, but yeah. And so, that we spend time there. I'm on one of the budget review subcommittees also for economic development and tourism. So that's and that's a big part of our budget process. We have these budget review subcommittees that go through little pieces, and that kind of gets folded up to appropriations and revenue. And the last one I'm on is state government. So that's things like elections and pensions and state employees, and so yeah, it's always interesting. You never know. that one we actually got to. We had Governor DeSantis from Florida come up and present to our state government committee back to session. So he's been pushing a national balanced budget amendment, and so he's been going state by state to try to convince us that we need a constitutional convention to address that issue. And so that was an interesting discussion.
I bet that was.
Yeah.
So many things. And we could do a whole podcast just on AI and data centers and the tech stuff, Yeah. But thank you so much for sharing your time. But before we let you go, we do a lightning round with all of our guests.
Right.
If you're up for that, just 5 quick questions.
Sure.
All righty. We'll start with an easy one. What is your favorite junk food?
Chili spaghetti or Cincinnati style chili. I don't know if that's junk food though. I mean, I make my own, which is better than any of them out there, but I think it's a well-balanced, healthy meal, but some people call it junk food, I guess.
Especially all the cheese on it.
I don't think it's too bad.
When you put the onions on it and stuff, you're fine.
Yeah, right. It's got vegetables. Come on, we're good.
Yeah.
I make mine too, and you make a big pot of it, and then you freeze it, and then when you hurry, you just pull it out.
Yep.
Yeah, I like that one. All right, what is one thing people don't know about you? Do you have any hidden talents?
I mean, well, maybe I'm a good cook. I bake. I make chili. I make lots of things. I can barbecue and grill out. So I can usually surprise people by how well I.
Oh, that's
and
chili,
I admire that. That's something I aspire to. I can't seem to really get going on it, but I admire that. Good job.
In fairness, Brian, your wife is a magnificent cook, so I think what, just sit on the bench on this one.
And she enjoys it. It's kind of a form of relaxation, and unwinding for her. And then I clean the kitchen like no other. So I think we got a pretty good gig going there.
That's what works. This one might be a little bit harder. If you could go back in time and tell younger Matt not to follow one fashion trend, what would it be?
I mean, I need somebody to tell me now what fashion trends I have no idea.
You always look good. You always look put together.
I thank my wife. I mean, that's all I was told. Is I've been told by my friends, and like there was before I met my wife and after I met my wife in 1997. So there's before 97 and after 97. I was told I dress a lot better after that, but I'm not exactly sure what any of it is. Yeah,
sounds like maybe a little bit of everything.
Yeah.
So everything before 97.
Anything I did before 97 was wrong. Let's go with it.
All righty, then we'll throw you an easy one here. What is your favorite day of the week?
Sunday. I do like
Sunday.
Starts quietly, and then just that. I think I like the tension of Sunday evenings. It's like you're kind of disappointed that this weekend's winding down, but it's like, what are you going to do that week? And I find that interesting.
Yes, I get the Sunday sweats. Like I'm like, I got to go to work tomorrow.
Yeah,
I'm retired. I don't even know what day it is.
It's all the same day. I mean,
yeah. Sweat. What's that? Never heard of it.
All righty. And if money were no object, what car would you own?
Let's say money. Well, and how about the environment wasn't a.
If there were no negative ramifications whatsoever.
So I would, and this is going to sound. I'd like an early 90s E-Class Mercedes when they had the diesel, these inline six diesel engines that they sounded like a tractor trailer. They lasted forever. I would love to have a rebuilt, really well maintained, and that's like actually what the old Pope Mobile was. So they're really big. You could drive over potholes, never feel them. It's like I like the power of a good German-made diesel engine. So
you're a car guy.
Or we found out they were all cheating and on their emissions and stuff.
Yeah, right. Exactly. Before that.
Good stuff. Well, thank you for playing along.
Anytime.
Yeah, Matt. Thanks a lot for joining us. I mean, we really appreciate everything you're doing for Kentuckians down there in Frankfort, and just taking the time to share your perspective with our viewers and listeners. Thanks again.
Yeah. Well, thank you. This was a lot of fun. Hope to do it again.
All right.
Yeah,
thanks.
we would love to have you back.
Bye-bye. Well, thank you all for listening. And don't forget, you can join the conversation at our Facebook and Instagram pages or at bluedotpodcast.com. And of course, if you like listening to our podcast, consider to donate to it. And you can do that by clicking the donate button at bluedotpodcast.com. Until next time, stay curious, keep the facts in focus, and never stop fighting for what matters. Peace out, everybody.